given this environment growing up, you learn that like these are the ways that neurotypical people expect you to act, that they act themselves. And so after a while, you start to learn, okay, well, if I mimic these behaviors, then things will just be a lot easier, right? Mm-hmm. Like it'll be easier to communicate with others. People will be more, receptive to my needs, to these other things, and like people, like I'll have friends, like I'll like all of these things, right? But the problem is that it's just that it's a mask. It's performative.
Alex, hey, welcome to the Bug Mind, where we dive deep into the mind of the developers. How are you today?
I'm doing well, thank you. Thank you for having me. How are you?
I'm so happy to be here, be able to talk with you. I'm sure this episode is going to be very special. When I was preparing it, I was very, very happy. But before I jump the gun, let's start with the basics. Who are you? What do you do in tech?
Yeah, let's see. My name's Alex. I am an engineering manager at a tech company in the U.S. called Thumbtack. Basically, we specialize in connecting homeowners with home professionals like plumbers and contractors and all these other people that they might not be that they might need.
When are you coming to the UK? Because I may need that.
No plans yet, but eventually, hopefully. It's interesting because each country seems to have its own. It's slightly different country by country as to the culture around this sort of thing. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's so weird. It's so complicated in the UK. But talking about complicated things. Yeah. We're here to talk about mental health. And as usual, I like to open the conversation with my guest with one very simple question. Like, how did you first become aware of your own mental health?
Well, I mean, I've known about my anxiety for a long time, since I was young. But it wasn't really until my 20s when I started putting things more together in terms of, potentially being autistic. So I, in a lot of ways, I was really lucky in that my wife used to, work with young autistic children. She has her master's degree in special education and, had a lot of experience. And so, as we progressed through our relationship, she kept noticing things that kind of like reminded her of things that she was familiar with from teaching. And so, over time, we were kind of joking about like all the different parallels that we were seeing. And, after a while, it kind of, we were just thinking like, this sounds like it could be, it could be true. And there was actually a book, the name of it is The Journal of Best Practices. So, and it's about this autistic man. This man who didn't know that he was autistic, but he was married, and kind of like his journey into figuring out, that he was autistic, what it meant, and basically he would he would leave Post-it notes with the different rules to follow, basically. And so, yeah, it was just him. It was a great story of somebody being late diagnosed, that I think, I started to draw a lot more parallels to. And then really, I think what did it was finding the autistic community on what used to be Twitter. And, just like seeing so much content that I really related to, and thinking, okay, well, if I relate to all of these different things, like, if I related to one or two of them, then maybe not, but like if I relate so strongly on like so many of these things, then like it's worth looking into. And so, I took the next step in terms of an official diagnosis, which is I went to get a neuropsych evaluation. And, as part of that, it was about an hour of going through my history, my background, and then a few hours of going through various tests.
Interesting.
Testing my ability to remember a series of numbers, to draw things from memory, like all of these things. And so at the end of all of that, I was told that I was not autistic. And that, I was the reasoning for that came down to I had a job, I had friends, I had I had a partner, I had all of these things that I couldn't have if I was if I were actually autistic. And like I'd made it this far. Obviously I'm not. And unfortunately, what it felt like the intent was to spare me from being diagnosed as autistic. I very much got the feeling that they were trying to, not to burden me with that. But actually, it ended up being, or I mean, it was really discouraging to hear that, because all of us, I spent the last quite a while like starting to see autism as the reasoning behind a lot of things, and like a lot of things that didn't make sense were kind of starting to click together, and then all of a sudden I'm told no, that's not it, and then I'm just kind of back at square one with all of these disparate things. And so that was really difficult.
Nice. I mean, it sounds like it was a very, this brings to mind, and that's why I was saying nice, is because it brings to mind a parallel with another guest that we had in the past, which was Sarah Vieira, and she was talking about depression and ADHD. And she mentioned how for her reaching the diagnosis of ADHD was actually liberating. Getting the label was like, oh, actually now all these things make sense. And I'm sorry that you had to deal with that first experience of kind of like, no, actually, JK, you have to go back to square one. But after that, you were actually able, right, to get a second diagnosis after a while?
Yeah. So after that, I kept tabs on the autistic community, and I kept feeling like I was a part of this thing. And so I think it was about a year later, I decided that I wanted to try again. But kind of knowing what I knew at that point, I knew that I wanted to find the right person to do my evaluation. I wanted to find somebody who has a lot of experience working with adults, has experience working with late diagnosed adults, is very does weight heavily on lived experience, and these sorts of things, and just like in general seems open to autism and the autistic community and autistic individuals.
Gotcha.
And that took quite a while. I went through countless websites and everything to try to find people, and inevitably there was something that turned me away from one or the other. I ended up getting a suggestion from my therapist, actually, for somebody who wasn't super close. They were in New York, but but they were actually really good. And so I went to their website. I felt comfortable. I reached out to them. It kind of slowly started things out, and then we went in and did the full testing. And so that is when I got my official autism diagnosis.
Nice. And with that, you can kind of feel like relieved. You feel a bit more in control of your situation, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, and so that is another thing that I think is important, particularly within the autism community, is that so there are people who have been diagnosed medically, and then there are people who are self-diagnosed, and those would include me. Like when I'd gone for my first testing, and that's kind of what led me to my subsequent one, where based on my lived experience and all of the information that I can find from other autistic people, there are so many similarities that that it seems very unlikely that I'm not, and it's slightly controversial, but it's also extremely important, I think, for the autistic community, because I mean, it's difficult to access testing for many reasons. Insurance and money is one of them. Finding a provider who works with adults, who will actually listen to you, are all different things. You're unless you find a provider who's willing to listen to you, you're not likely to get a diagnosis, because you've spent your entire life masking and quote unquote high functioning. They're going to look at that and say, oh no, you can't be autistic. And so like the bar basically for getting a diagnosis is so high that we can't just accept only people with actual medical diagnoses, because that's not going to be everybody. In an ideal world, it's super easy to get tested and everything, but we're not there.
Gotcha. And yeah, I mean, you brought up a few keywords that I would like to touch base on in a second. Yeah. But, for example, I wanted to flag up, you mentioned a couple of times, both in the books and in your experience, that, getting a diagnosis as an adult is much harder. Because again, you mentioned, they also look at your life experiences, and like, if you have, a wife, friends, a job, they're like, oh, probably you don't. Which is, it sounds like it's, at least when it comes to autism, like the fact that late diagnosis is a problem. Like it's kind of like making the rounds a bit, correct? Like it's becoming there's more awareness about that as being a problem.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot more awareness, and it's because so much of our understanding of autism, especially amongst the medical community, but just in general, is based on stereotypes, and is based on a very limited subset of people. Like it is basically based on young white boys. And a very specific way that they present. So that also makes it more difficult for anybody who's not a young white boy, because autism might present differently in them than somebody else. And so if that's the checklist that you're using, you're going to miss a lot of people. And that's really just like how a lot of people get missed as children, is because they don't perfectly match these stereotypes.
Yeah, and I guess it's also because representation in also the broader media, let's say, like when you think about an autistic person, probably there are very few movies where there's representation that is past like Rayman. That's usually the type of representation that you have. It's like this very like well-defined, this one specific way. So yeah, I can totally see how that affects, like, oh, unless you're specifically like that, oh, you're not autistic.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. And I want to take a step back. Maybe now we've introduced, overall the concept, the problem of like it's hard to get diagnosed because it can present in so many different ways. So let's take a step back and let's answer maybe a bit more broadly for people, like me that want to learn a bit more. Like, if you had to describe autism right now, how would you do that? What would be like a more general, a more comprehensive definition of autism?
Yeah, so I like the definition provided by an organization called Neuroclastic, which is it's a heightened level of conscious processing of raw information signals from the environment, and an absence or significantly reduced level of subconscious filtering of social information. So, which is a lot of words to basically say that you're, much more keyed in on what's going on around you, and not only are you getting much more signal, you have a harder time filtering out the noise from that signal. Yeah.
Nice. And that, how would that manifest, for example? Like in your case, how would you describe that in more like practical scenarios?
Yeah, so for me, I think one way that manifests very clearly is if I'm having a conversation in a group, for instance, and say we're sitting at a dinner table or something, and I'm communicating with you, and two other people are communicating across us. If I weren't, or if my brain worked in a less autistic way, I probably wouldn't be as keyed into the conversation that's happening across us. And even if I would be better able to kind of filter that out and focus on the conversation that you and I are having. But, because of the way that my brain works, my brain is very hyper aware of everything going on around me. So it's not just the conversation that's kind of happening across. It's the person who's kind of moving from one side of the room to the other. It's, the fork that gets dropped on the floor. Like it's literally everything, right? Where for more neurotypical people, like a lot of that just gets filtered out automatically. And so for me, it's a more conscious effort to know what it is that it is signal and what it is that is noise.
Okay, yeah, I think that's a very clear example also because it's a very common situation. We've all been there. You go out with other people and then like there are multiple conversations. So yeah, I think it's a very interesting and very easy to understand explanation. So thank you for that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I was just thinking, like, I think it's also a really good example of how seemingly easy, innocuous things can actually be very difficult for people depending on the way that their brain works.
Yeah, and that's a very nice point to make because it follows perfectly where I wanted to go a bit with this conversation, which was actually picking up again something that you mentioned earlier, because you mentioned masking, which is a word that has a very specific meaning in this context. And you were just mentioning, for neurotypical people, this is how things would happen. So what is masking?
Ooh, what is masking?
Yeah, I like asking easy questions to my guests. So.
Yeah, no, big open-ended questions. How much time do you have? Okay, so masking in this specific case is the act of an autistic person I want to say performing neurotypicalism.
I think it's a very classy way of explaining it. I love it.
Yeah. So I mean, perhaps it's better if I kind of go into why it happens. So, you know, like from a very, very young age, autistic people, you know, living in a neurotypical world are, you know, told that the way that they think, the way that they act, the way that they feel, isn't correct. It's not the neurotypical way of feeling, thinking, or acting, and to the extent that we actually have entire areas. We have entire fields that are dedicated to trying to get autistic people to act more neurotypical, which is in itself problematic. But so like given this environment growing up, you learn that like these are the ways that neurotypical people expect you to act, that they act themselves. And so after a while, you start to learn, okay, well, if I mimic these behaviors, then things will just be a lot easier, right? Mm-hmm. Like it'll be easier to communicate with others. People will be more, receptive to my needs, to these other things, and like people, like I'll have friends, like I'll like all of these things, right? But the problem is that it's just that it's a mask, it's performative, and so it is this extra layer of effort that an autistic person has to do in order to come across as neurotypical, or and like going back to our table discussion example, normally, because of all of the things that are going on around me, I might have a harder time processing what it is that you're saying, right? And so in an ideal world, I would either be able to ask us to move to a quieter location, or I might ask you again if I didn't quite hear what you said. But if I'm trying if I'm trying to be more, quote, normal, I might try to use context clues based on what it is that you said previously to kind of guess what it is that you were saying, or I might even kind of nod, or kind of just like yeah, some sort of open perfunctory answer that like might keep you going so that I can kind of catch up, and it happens more often than I would like.
Maybe can I try to make an example as well?
Yeah.
I would imagine, because I know like a friend of a friend, they are autistic, and for them in particular is touch based, like different textures, like overwhelm them in different ways. Like, if something is a very specific texture, is like I cannot even be close to that thing. And so another example of masking would probably be maybe this person will like, I don't like touching things because the textures, but like they would shake your hand when they meet you just because they know that that's the norm, that's what's expected of them.
Yep.
Would that worked, right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And if our dear listeners are curious to learn more, actually, there was a blog post that I found while we were researching this episode from, I think, Jessica Opal, which is another person that is an advocate in this space about her high masking, I think, throughout COVID. So, yeah, if you want to learn more, we're going to have some resources. We're going to have the book that Alex mentioned earlier. So everything's going to be down there. Now, we got to a better understanding of autism is we got to the point in your story where you got the diagnosis at the second try, and finally it's after. So did anything in particular change in your life post the diagnosis? Did you find that certain things were different? How did that change?
Yes and yes. So yes, in that. So one yes is because everything changed, which is that COVID happened, right? And so that deeply affected how well I was able to mask. or how not well I was able to. And the other thing was, by getting my diagnosis, it was really helpful because I already understood the way that my brain worked, based on all of the interaction that I've been doing, communicating with others. But it wasn't really until I got my formal diagnosis that I really let myself believe that. Before that, I would know that, I was having a hard time doing this, or I couldn't do that, for these reasons. But there was a little voice in the back of my head saying, but you don't know if you're autistic, and also, is that just an excuse? It's and so having that diagnosis, having somebody affirm my experiences was incredibly helpful there.
And did that change in any way how you interacted at work, or how does it work when you're an autistic person in tech, or how did it work for you? Because I kind of know the answer now, but I wanted to know how we got there. And spoiler, you have a great page on your website that kind of describes your way of working, and there's a specific section about your autism, your communication style, and we'll get there. But I wanted to know if there was any intermediate step to get there.
Yeah, so it definitely did change the way that I interacted. I will say it was greatly accelerated by COVID. It probably would have been more gradual if it hadn't, if COVID hadn't happened. Because really, what happened with COVID was that, all of a sudden, I'd spent my entire life basically using anxiety as a fuel to help me be productive, to remember all of the different rules when interacting with people, and all of these things. And so all of a sudden with COVID, all of my anxiety was being used trying to stay alive, right? And so I no longer had any despair, and so I couldn't keep up the facade, and so that took a big toll both on my ability to do work, but also just my own mental health. And so in order to get past that, I realized that I needed to figure out how to operate without anxiety as my fuel source, and that took a really long time. It's honestly, I'm still working on parts of it, and it's been
I was leaning towards the screen, maybe yes, the answer, maybe I don't need to work with anxiety as my fuel. But it's a process for everyone, for sure.
It's easier said than done, right? And the thing that I've actually learned over the years is that I think, the way that I think about it is, in my brain there's this machine, and this machine is what's responsible for all of the executive functioning. It's what's reminding me to do things, checking up, it's keeping everything up to date and everything. For most people, this machine needs very, very little fuel. And or their body is able to create enough fuel for this machine that it's usually not a problem. For people like me, that machine needs a lot of fuel in order to be able to run effectively. And so, anxiety is one fuel that works. It's not very sustainable. It's the gas of this of this machine, if you will. But there are definitely other ways of doing that, and part of my journey has been trying to figure out how to offload some of that executive functioning onto various apps, if I'm able to write things down, keep lists, keeping that so that it doesn't have to live in my brain in working memory the whole time, is helpful. And actually very recently, as of about almost 6 months ago, I started on ADHD medication, which was incredibly helpful. I'm honestly kind of frustrated that it took this long to figure out that that might be helpful.
Yeah, because autism in itself is not necessarily an illness, but an autistic person can have other mental health illnesses like ADHD, for example, correct?
Yeah, and it's one of the things that I'm still not sure about. My wife is ADHD, and so we know that there's a lot of overlap between us. We're trying to figure out like how much is that autism on her part and ADHD on my part. And there are a lot of people who are both. I think that I am primarily autistic, but I mean there is a lot of overlap in terms of executive functioning for one. And so some of the things that can be helpful are also helpful for me. And so basically these medication end up replacing anxiety as a fuel for this machine. And it makes things infinitely easier to actually get done.
Oh, that's good to hear. Like I'm glad that you're finding a better way to replace that original fuel, because anxiety, yeah, as you mentioned, like it's very not efficient. It's very like not nice to have to feed off of it, especially when you produce so much. There was a question that was popping into my head. So you mentioned, rebalancing, like, okay, now I understand better how my brain works. I can, figure out the mechanism of this machine. One element that is prevalent in your website where you described your way of working and your autism is communication. Like, how did that kind of like came to be? How do you like, so it's on your website, but then like, for example, did you write it first and then you pitched it to your managers and the people below you? Or was it like a thing that came together over time, like you had a few written rules with people and then you're like, oh, you know what, I should actually collect all of them? And also which are the things that you write there? I think a lot of people would be interested in learning like what you say about that.
Yeah, no, it's definitely something that I've collected over time. I started back 2 jobs ago. Really when I first became a manager, I think, where so like for me as an autistic person, setting expectations is incredibly important. I find that if I'm able to set expectations with people, interactions go much more smoothly. And that's because, people predominantly expect interactions in one specific, way. And so anything kind of outside of that is difficult for them to deal with, might frustrate them, might whatever, and collaboration suffers as a result. So if I'm able to figure out the way that I work best and I'm able to share that with others, then that prepares them for when they for when they receive the 3 or 4 paragraph Slack message, which is just like a brain dump of a few different things, and so yeah, I think that's really where it came out of, and I think it's been incredibly helpful. It's something that I share with everybody when I join a team or when somebody else joins the team. Like it's the first thing that I send to people, just to kind of start things off on the right foot.
And what does this say, for example? Like I know there are a few bullet points and we don't need to read it line by line, but like in general, for example, what does it say?
Yeah, I mean, so it's it really goes through everything, including, you know, my role, the things that I value, like honesty and communication, critical thinking. It goes over my expectations of others and kind of working with me. You know, I spend a lot of time talking about one-on-ones because as a manager, those are, for me, probably the most important thing that I do. So, you know, so I spend time talking about that. I talk about how, well, I mean, this is more relevant to when I was actually in an office, but, you know, when I used to work in an office, I would sometimes feel weird sitting at my desk. So you'd often find me in the cafeteria or something like that, sitting and working there. And so people needed to know that I'm not hiding. Like I'm not, you can come find me. It's just, I'm not at my desk.
Interesting.
You know, these sorts of things.
Interesting.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was curious to know if, for example, since you started doing this, you've inspired like anyone on your team to do the same, or like, did it ever happen to you that you were also on the receiving end of like some kind of like these communication guidelines?
Yeah.
Do you find them useful when you receive them, or it's like, okay, maybe some of these things are gonna be hard for me to deal with?
So to answer your first question, yes, I have had people on my teams who've done something similar, or I've had colleagues who've done something similar, and I have also received them from others, which is awesome. In general, I really like them. I think it might be overwhelming or something if so. I would say, you know, when you're on the receiving end of something like this, it would be a mistake to think that you have to abide by all of these things all of the time. And like, this is the only way that I work. And if you want to work with me, this is the way that you have to work. It's not. Like it's not prescriptive. It's just saying, you know, for me, this is the way that I generally work. And so like you can interact with me however you want. But like, this is kind of the way that I'm expecting things. And so like, there might be a little bit of friction if we do this way or that way. And so I think in that regard, they're much more useful as like a reference than, something you read once and then just kind of do for eternity. You know, they're definitely very useful in terms of, oh, maybe I got a message from somebody and I'm like, that seems a little weird. And then maybe I look through their README and it's like, oh, you know, their communication style's a little bit more like this. That, you know, that makes sense. I get it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it was good to call out, like, it's not a strict set of rules that you need to comply with all the time, because, like, my head was immediately like, okay, I need to follow this rule strictly all the time. So, you know, sometimes it's important to explain that as well. Yeah. Like, especially if you were my manager, I would be like, holy shit. But no, I think it's absolutely great. And, you know, we've been talking about working in tech as an autistic person, and kind of going into a bit of why I even wanted to do this episode. I find that in general, it's important to create the awareness. It's important to, you know, share the right type of information about autism, which is why I wanted to talk with you, because I feel that in tech in particular, there's a lot of, aside from people self-diagnosing, which, as we mentioned, is important because of the things we mentioned, but also I think there's a lot of misconceptions and misunderstandings. And, you know, for example, I think that a lot of people, as throwaway comments, they would say, oh yeah, tech is full of, you know, neurodivergent people, autistic people. And that is always a bit not the best to hear when you hear it. But like, in your experience, like being an autistic person, like, do you think that, is it that prevalent? Do you think there are many people in tech that are in the autism?
I mean,
autistic, sorry.
Yes, and so part of that is just because I think that there's a lot more people in general than than they realize who are autistic. I forget the exact stats now, but like, being autistic is a lot more common than people think. Whether or not they know that they're autistic, or that they have the diagnosis. So like there are a lot of people who, for example, just kind of operate thinking they have these quirks, these idiosyncrasies, these things that aren't autism, are just kind of like the weird, their weirdness, right? And so yeah, I do think there's a lot of that, and I think particularly within tech, I've definitely come across a lot of people who I've thought could be autistic, but I think I was gonna say that I think in a lot of ways it's not super helpful to like, even for me as an autistic person, to like sit here and like try to figure out, are you autistic, really, really when it comes down to collaboration, it's about kind of like, it's more individualized than, are you autistic? Yes, no. This is how I interact with you if you are. This is how I interact with you if you're not. And so yeah.
Yeah, and from that, and the fact that there are a lot of neurodivergent people in tech, surprisingly enough, I was also reading an article from Atlassian, where they were saying actually for neurodivergent people, tech might even be where they are not performing their best, because increasingly over the years, and especially since COVID, like there's a lot of communication. You need to be on a lot of calls. You need to be able to communicate effectively in very specific ways, which again are kind of the opposite of like accommodating people. And this is where I wanted to maybe like finish a bit our conversation before the usual final question at the end, which is, so there are a lot of neurodivergent people in tech. How do we make it better for everyone? Like, do you have any ideas or any opinions on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of comes down to who has a responsibility to make things accessible to everybody. Like, if we think about autistic people or disabled people in general, or anybody, and we think, this is like, you are autistic, it is your job to figure out how to accommodate yourself in a world that is built for neurotypical people, then that's how we end up in situations like this, where we have a lot of people who are having a hard time communicating with others, not necessarily because they can't communicate, but because they have a harder time communicating in these specific ways. And so if we push away from that and think of this as a societal responsibility, like if everybody has a responsibility to be as accommodating as possible, then that puts us in a much better place. And so instead of saying like, these are the specific ways that you need to collaborate, you might be able to say, these are the outcomes that we want to achieve. These are some ways in which we think that we can achieve them. But just like in general, any way that you achieve them is fine. So, maybe that means, I don't know, a Slack thread stand up versus a virtual or in-person stand up, or kind of like async work versus synchronous work. These sorts of things that I feel like feel like big things, but actually aren't. They're only big things because that's just the way that we've always done things, and we like the way that we've always done things. But if we let go of that, and we focus on what is it that we're specifically trying to get out of this, then that opens us up to being able to work in a much more flexible way. And I think, the really important thing to drive home, is that when we do this, when we engage in this kind of this kind of universal accessibility thinking, is that it doesn't just benefit people who are autistic, people who are disabled. It benefits everybody, right? Because even people who are neurotypical, they have their own needs, and so because of society, they also believe that their needs might necessarily matter, and so by opening all of this up, it gives them also the flexibility to do what they need to do to work the way that they work best. All of these things.
Yeah, that sounds so important. Like this concept of like disability accommodation being actually a net benefit for everyone. And it sounds like on a more practical level, if like someone like an EM or in a tech company, probably the most practical way they could approach this is literally, first off, be aware that people may need, to be heard and to figure out like what is the best way you want to do your work. So it sounds like the first step is a conversation. It's like, hey, if you have a team of 10, 5 people in some form, something like that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's the really important but also really difficult thing about people management in general, is that it has to be individualized. Like you can't assume that every person's going to interact or is going to need the same things, is going to want the same things, and so it's really important to have these conversations with people on your teams to know how best you can support them, all of these things.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think this is a great kind of actionable that we can leave as an homework for the people that are listening. Yeah. This has been an absolutely lovely conversation, and I'm so happy that I had the chance to talk with you, Alex. If anyone is still around, still listening, it's probably like 40 minutes long episode, something like that. Like, what would be like the one key learning that you want them to walk away from our conversation with?
Ooh, let's see. It's difficult. It's funny because I had one on the top of my head at the beginning. I mean, so the thing that comes to mind is that everybody is different. Autistic people aren't the exact same. Rethink the way that you think about autistic people, about disabled people in general. Sorry, this is coming out more scattered than one coherent thought. But don't live your life assuming you will never need accommodation.
Yeah,
I think it's probably the easiest way of putting it.
Yeah, and I think it's a great learning. I mean, if we wanted to go more into this, as like disabilities can also be temporal. So, there's that entire spectrum. Yeah. So, absolutely, yeah. Don't you cannot take for granted. They're like, no, as things work today, it's going to be always fine for me. I don't need to accommodate anyone. I'm just like...
People love to believe that they're always going to be in their 20s, at peak physical condition, mental condition, everything. They're not going to have any sort of encumberments or...
Yeah. Oh, life will teach you all. Alex, this has been absolutely a pleasure. I'm very grateful that you decided to do this episode with me. Thank you so much. I hope you're going to have a great weekend, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care.
Thank you for having me. Take care.